All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Abby Edens. I'm Director of Education at the National World War II Museum, and I want to welcome you to our Real History Filmmaker Talk. Today's talk features the documentary Path to the Past, and joining us today to discuss the film and the story behind it is my colleague, Nathan Hugen, Director of Educational Travel, and filmmaker Lou Bacheski. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Nathan and Lou.
Thank you, Abby.
This is a great, I think the date of this program, it's December 17th, 76th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge was yesterday as far as the initial German offensive into the Ardennes. Today being December 17th would be the anniversary of Malmedy and of the massacre of the Wereth 11. And at this point, 76 years ago, divisions like the 28th Division in Luxembourg and the 106th spread out along the Belgian border are almost at their breaking points. And we'd see the 106th surrender very soon in huge numbers around the sector of Saint-Vith in Belgium. It's something that speaks to me is my great uncle Sparky was in that 106th, and he'd be surrendering 76 years ago in the next few days. And these journeys of going back, last year I had the chance to go back into the area where his regiment was, just on that Belgian-German border, and to see what he saw in those early days. And having Lou with us today, he's someone who followed a path all the way from Normandy and then into Germany and into Belgium and then into southern Germany and eventually ending up in Nordhausen following his grandfather's footsteps. And Lou has written a book called Luch, a nickname for his grandfather, and has a documentary called Path to the Past. And Lou, Abby's going to put on the sizzle reel for your film here if you want to say a few words about this before Abby plays it.
Well, the sizzle reel itself is, just kind of an amalgam of different shots, but it gives people a pretty good idea of the scope of the film. But it's me following the path from Normandy into central Germany that my grandfather in the 3rd Armored Division took, and he and I worked together for many years to write the book. And so it was a very powerful experience, to say the least.
All right, so Abby?
My grandfather always talked about going back to Europe and seeing these places, and I had always hoped that he would go with me on this trip. After my grandfather passed, I decided to fly across the Atlantic and retrace his harrowing journey through all 5 major European campaigns. He served as a Sherman tank driver in the 3rd Armored Division from the initial landings in Normandy to the bloody end of the war. There's a quote by Maya Angelou, who I revere, and she said, history, despite its wretched pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And I think that's the point of all this, is that not looking at who to blame. It's generation after generation we commit the same ridiculousness. I was in a infantry museum. We went to the infantry museum, my grandfather and my dad, and we were walking through, and it's just like today. Well, there's the statues, or the mannequins with the clothes on and everything else. So it had World War I, Spanish-American War, and the World War II, and Vietnam. And my dad just turned to my grandfather and said, "We don't learn a damn thing, do we, Dad?" And my grandfather just went, like, "No, just sure don't seem like it, I don't know. People don't learn from anything, and I'm probably not going to change that, but at least I could tell the story. I would think, but
the great part of it is that his grandfather is able to sort of see it come together at the end of his life, and see this both sort of a tribute and a great history to himself. So, and an act of love on the part of a grandson for a grandfather. It's that they can't, tough to look away from that part of it.
We are in Insigne sur Mer. Insigne by the sea. And this will be the first leg of the journey.
Most Americans, when they think of World War II, they think of the American army sweeping across Europe from west to east, and the Germans, while putting up a fight, were doomed to lose. And that was not true. And generally, the Germans had better equipment. They were extremely well trained, that the German tanks were far superior to the American Sherman tanks. Really, you could count on one hand the pieces of equipment that the U.S. Army had that were really superior than what the Germans had. The Sherman tank is probably Exhibit A of the inferior American equipment in World War II. Those tankers, I don't know how they made it. I don't know how the ones who survived did survive. And of course, a lot of them didn't survive.
He saw the tanks get destroyed and all the infantry killed on the back. And my grandfather panicked. Even after being all the combat that he was in all the campaigns before this, he still got scared.
You can say everything you want about this patriotism and everything else, but boy, when your life is in stake, you think about your life.
The fact that Lou saw probably tens of thousands of dead, the aftermath of so many of these horrific battles, still came home, was able to raise a family, and it's something that you don't really see in a lot of the Hollywood movies today. The battles happen, credits roll, but you don't see that these things, they stick with the soldiers and the Marines for the rest of their lives.
Early on, when I discovered that the 3rd Armored had suffered more casualties, men and equipment, than any other armored division, and actually took a look at the numbers in the armored regiments and also in the armored infantry, it's astounding to me that anyone could have started at the beginning and been in the campaigns, even with the vagaries of where you are on the battlefield. The fact that Luch survived without a scratch from beginning all the way to the end is why I think some people get religion who you never would have thought would. It's just beyond any calculation of the odds.
So this program, this talk with Lou, it came to me because I work in travel. I plan the museum's tours that go to battlefields all over the world. And, when I got the email that said, give Lou a call, we'll go through his book, what we're going to talk about, how this program will be set up, I noticed the exact same area code that my cell phone has, an area code 618, the metro east of St. Louis, Missouri. This would be Southern Illinois, roughly heading from a little bit south of the state capital all the way down to the southern tip of Illinois. And, as I talked to Lou, the amount of research that he did, the amount of knowledge that he gained in retracing his grandfather's footsteps. And then I see that he's from Pocahontas, Illinois, 30 miles north of the same little town that I grew up in, called Germantown, Illinois. And so the connections just flowed from there. And I think that Lou's impetus for doing this research was the way that he got to know his grandfather along a little place, a little creek called Shoal Creek, where you saw the sign in the sizzle reel. And in Lou's book, he writes about this creek, that it's not akin to the Montana trout stream which ran through it in Norman Maclean's book. On the contrary, this creek gurgled and slumped through it and still does. It, meaning cow pastures, corn and bean fields, and under highway overpasses, which consequently serve as good campsites. And when I talked to Lou, he said a lot about the life lessons that both he learned and his grandfather learned along Shoal Creek. And Lou, if you want to just paint that picture of a childhood along Shoal Creek and your grandfather as well.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing that part of it up, because it's one thing I don't get many opportunities to speak about, because most people focus on the war. But I really felt it was an injustice to my grandfather's story to not get into the background of how he was as a grandfather and how he was as a person, full spectrum, in spite of what he saw and had to do in the war. And I thought that was such an important thing. And it was personally such an important thing to grow up. We would, for weeks, prepare for fishing out there, and we would try to do it a couple times a year. And always when we were running the lines, the hope was late at night, perhaps Grandpa might tell some stories about how it was in Pocahontas, say, during the Depression, or maybe he would tell a story about the war. And I think he felt comfortable enough there to dig into that, because he and his friends, a lot of them, which I discuss in the book, most of them all ended up in the First Army, miraculously. And so he was comfortable enough there to kind of dig into it. And then there's a great Hemingway story about a river that he and his dad and grandfather fished. And the name of it's ailing me. It's like Big Two-Hearted River, I think is the title of it. But he's talking about a veteran coming back from war and having that experience with family to kind of go somewhere else than the war and kind of reduce life to these very simple principles. And that was very appealing to my grandfather and all of us.
And so your grandfather growing up, the creek's a little bit different today. I know the way you describe it is that you can see some Kenmores and Frigidaires and sometimes a car abandoned in the creek. What are some of those lessons that your grandfather picked up that you think would have helped him during the war?
I think that there's a really good quote that I include in the book. It's a Lao Tzu quote, and he says, "He who makes everything easy finds everything hard. Therefore, the sage makes everything difficult. He therefore finds nothing hard." And I think in the way that they grew up, everything that they did had a level of tough, hard work to it. And that he wanted to teach that to his sons and my uncles and my dad and myself, that you get a value out of that hard work. And there was this strange meeting of kind of order and chaos in that act of fishing, where you just simplified things to these very laid out forms that Grandpa had tried and true methods. And in the process, it was very therapeutic, and fishing was a big thing for him and for the rest of his life. And I think it was a way for him to clear his head from what he had seen in the war. And it's definitely a contrast to the chaos and absurdity that was, where there was this stillness and this place that had some sense to it, that he understood the order of it, where, in contrast, the war was this chaos that he barely made it through, never really understood why even that he made it through. And that was really part of his whole life. But that ethic of hard work was really something that was important to me my whole life. And I wanted to impart that in the book too.
And I think it's something that your book does very effectively. Is it's not a war chronology of he was born, he grew up, he joined the army, and then he found himself in Europe. It kind of plays into some of the flashbacks of the lessons. And what was it that led you to decide to structure the book that way instead of a straight sort of chronological narrative?
Well, it was because I had seen so many books exactly like what you were talking about, that a person, grows up, there's just kind of these vague details about their early life. Then they go to war, and then kind of it's done after that. There's really not much in the detail. Maybe, oh, they got married, they had 5 kids, and that's it. But in this case, I had the opportunity to know this man full spectrum. And a lot of people don't ever get that opportunity. And all the veterans events that I've done over the years, invariably, someone always comes up to me with tears in their eyes and says, my dad would never talk, or my husband would never talk, or, even present day men and women serving, same kind of stories that, maybe they have a son or a daughter that's serving now, and that they just held all this in. And so I felt it was very important for me to show not just what he did in these really horrifying moments of his life, but how he set an example of being an exceptional human being through the rest of his life. And there's a really good quote by Carl Jung, who I think kind of typifies that. And it says that a tree can't grow to heaven unless it has roots down to hell. And I think that is a very succinct explanation of my grandfather. He saw the absolute worst of humanity, but he chose, instead of embracing that darkness, or he worked his way through it and really became just an exceptional person to everybody he met, everybody he knew, just thought the world of the man. And he was and I think another important point is there's talk about the greatest generation. And he was great, or any of the other greatest generation people I've met that were like him, they were great not in the fact that they did and accomplished all these things, but their humility in spite of that. And that's why they were great. And that's why he was so great. Because if you talk to him, he would just say, oh, I was a tanker. He never made a big deal about his experience, because he knew there were people that had it way worse than him, people that were captured and never returned, people who were killed, and so many people that he saw personally.
Now, the Pocahontas, Illinois can seem very removed from worldwide events, especially in the 1930s, and the images of your grandfather and his friends cutting their own fishing poles, and the way they would head out to the creek to fish. How did your father or your grandfather end up in the Army and ending up in Task Force Lovelady in the 3rd Armored Division?
He was actually working at a small arms plant over in St. Louis. So he they drafted him and he went to Jefferson Barracks, and they gave him just the choice of, do you want to go into the Navy or the Armed Forces, I think was how he put it. And he, having never seen the ocean or knowing nothing about the sea, he just thought, well, Armed Forces was a better bet. And through a roundabout way, he ended up training in tanks at initially Fort Knox, and then they were shipped around to Fort Polk and a few other places before they ended up heading over to England and training in the Salisbury Plains. And he spent a good deal of time there just preparing for the invasion, and what often said, I was glad I didn't go in the first wave, because if anybody knows about the first wave in relation to Sherman tanks, especially, they were most of them drowned or had horrible outcomes. So he went in the second wave of D-Day plus 17 on Omaha Beach, but the fighting was very close still.
You have a lot in your book about the Sherman tank, and your grandfather was a driver. One of the things that we do with certain high school programs we have is we'll ask them, as we stand in front of our own Sherman, where would you rather be, inside this or outside this? And at the start, before they go inside a tank, it's like all the hands go up that they'd rather be in than out. Then once they go in, they all want to be out. What have you learned about the Sherman through researching your grandfather's story?
Well, a lot of books, I would say erroneously, kind of claim, and these are some pretty substantial historians and respected, that they just say, well, it was adequate vehicle. You could put a lot of them on an LST. You could get a lot of them to deploy fast. And then there was some like Patton and so forth that felt that was actually an appropriate strategy. He himself said that tanks shouldn't engage other tanks, but they should actually go around them and seek objectives in the rear. Well, the problem with that was the Germans were effective soldiers and they were the best in the world. They weren't going to allow you to flank them, and they were going to consistently run into other tanks. And Grandpa's personal experience illustrates how terribly outgunned they were and how wrong these perceptions that it was adequate, because the in direct engagements with other tanks, like even say a Panther, for example, there's one story in the book where Grandpa his tank had a 76 millimeter, which is a little bit more effective than most, but it was still a lower velocity in comparison to Germans. And they knew they hit this Panther tank many times and were able to actually go look at it after the fighting died down. And they counted 19 ricochets off the front glacis plate of that tank. And I can't imagine the overwhelming fear that would have come over you when seeing that in those initial battles in Normandy. And statistics illustrate for the Third Armored, for example, they lost 87 tanks in the first 8 days of combat. So if for anyone to want to get back into that thing, I can't imagine how much courage it took for him to continually do that day to day. And it wasn't just other tanks, but the Germans had very effective grenade launchers, the Panzerfaust, the Panzerschreck. And then the tank had a lot of other fallibilities and issues with the gasoline tanks, the way the shells were stored. And he said almost every time, invariably, they would burst into flames when they were hit.
One thing about being in a tank is you're going to forge a very close relationship with the other 4 guys who are in there with you. And Joe Cady, the tank commander, comes out very well in your book. You want to tell us about some of the guys that were in that tank with your grandfather?
I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's been a cool kind of secondary saga to this whole thing. I had the hopes when Grandpa and I were working on the book to find each and every one of those families, whether Joe Cady, his family, and talk to him about what we were doing. And just strangely enough, I've just located all 5 families, and one who reached out to me via Facebook and located me because someone had recommended the book. That was Decker. But the main cohort that was in the tank for the greatest amount of time was Joe Cady was the tank commander. Then you had the gunner, it was Patrick Gillespie, the assistant gunner, Les Underwood, and then the assistant driver was Virgil Decker, and then my grandfather was driver. And those 5 men, made it all the way from Normandy into central Germany together. And it was when Joe Cady was killed in the Battle of the Bulge that they actually split up. But Cady got him through so much because he knew how that Sherman could operate tactically without getting destroyed and not directly engaging other tanks, and got into pretty heated arguments with a lot of officers. I don't know if you remember some of those stories in the book, but he didn't have any kind of filter. He would say, and because he knew it was their lives on the line, and were it not for the things that he did, my grandfather and I wouldn't be here. And my grandfather too is, dying day, he couldn't hardly talk about Joe Cady without becoming tearful, because they had survived so much together.
I think the quality of leadership was definitely an undercurrent in the book. And, there's a scene in there I remember from the Battle of the Bulge. I think it was a Lieutenant Burns, as you were sort of doing a contrast of the quality leadership that Joe Cady had provided, and then the less quality leadership you see elsewhere.
Right. It was after Cady was killed. They had a lieutenant take over his tank, and his name was Lieutenant Burns. But to his credit, it was such a frightening thing. Who knows how you would react in combat, and he broke down and couldn't command the tank. So specifically in the Battle of the Bulge, they lost everything. And in one particular engagement, which was a little later into January, which is something that's not talked about, and I appreciate the film kind of gets into it, is that a lot of the fighting wasn't in December. Some of the most gruesome fighting in the Battle of the Bulge was later in January when they had to really push the Germans back. Well, most people don't realize how wide the swath was, how big the Battle of the Bulge was. There were 1 million men actively engaged in it, and almost 1,000 German tanks and some 2,000 German pieces of artillery. It was just a massive battle. But the leadership, going back to that, he was very lucky to have had Katie's leadership all the way through. And like I said, I don't think he would have survived were it not for that most of the war. And after the Bulge later on, he was actually given a respite because he was the only driver that had survived that long. And he was put in the command tank for the company. And he served under a lieutenant who, oh, that's bothered me. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. But he had a great respect for that man. And for the rest of the war, he was kind of pulled back a little, not fully pulled back, but he was still involved, but didn't have to deal with as much on the front line.
Now, to sort of keep the tradition of how your book sort of does these callbacks to Shoal Creek, the one that was most vivid to me was walking through a culvert or kind of a tunnel with your grandfather. I think you were maybe 13, and he sees a swastika painted on the side of that culvert, and that to me seemed like the spark that sort of ignited this whole story that becomes a book and the documentary. And so tell us about that experience and what that did to both you and your grandfather.
Well, that was something that was always kind of in the back of my mind throughout the whole process, because when I was like 12 or 13, I think it was, we would go get bait fish and catch kind of smaller fish to catch larger catfish. And there was a little slough that was down the road from my grandfather's house on Keebler Road in Collinsville. And we would have to walk through this concrete culvert underneath the road to actually get to the good spot. Well, partway through that tunnel, almost to the end, Grandpa stopped, and there was something spray painted on the wall, which, we found out was a swastika. But at the time, I didn't really know much about what it meant. It was innocuous to me to some degree. But he just stood there and stared at it for, I would guess, maybe a good solid minute. And for my grandfather to do that and kind of change behavior, I just quietly stood there waiting, because there must have been some really significant thing that was going through his head. And later, the more and more I learned, I can't imagine what was rolling through his mind to see that he doing something that was very close to him, fishing with his grandson, walking down the street that's just down the road from his house, and see this symbol that to him was, took him across the world to go fight and see literally tens of thousands of dead people, through his own eyes, the concentration camps, fight Hitler's own division, which they fought during the Battle of the Bulge, and see countless atrocities in these small villages, to the actual Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. And so I can't imagine the reel that was going through his mind at that moment. And that always, was something important that I knew I had to include in the book. And it was always something I kept in mind, that this man, who to me was just the toughest human being I've ever known, and didn't get shaken up by much. But when that moment occurred, you could tell there was so much emotion behind that gaze, that I think the name Nazi is tossed around a little bit too much now. You say just a wrong word to someone, or you make an incorrect statement, and I don't think people have a very deep understanding of how horrifying that era really was for people.
Now, I'm going to move ahead to the journey that you have in the documentary, your own personal trip going to Normandy and across Europe. When and how did you go about setting that up?
Well, actually, I watched the movie Fury, and for various reasons was pretty perturbed, and not that all I'm going to get into, but I am the 3rd Armored Division historian for the association, and I've talked to a lot of World War II veterans, not just my grandfather and people in the book, but they were really appalled at how they were depicted in that. And then a lot of tankers that I know that are now at, Fort Benning and the training center and stuff were appalled at the way they showed them just kind of these empty-headed murderous types. And then a lot of the scenes were, although there's some very accurate parts, there's some that's, glamorized, and things like, a grenade being dropped in a tank, and then Brad Pitt gets to look all still handsome and so forth. It's like, sorry, the guy would have been, absolutely obliterated. And so that was part of the reason to get going on it. And it was something that Grandpa and I had talked about before. And when he passed, I just decided, now or never. So, and I'm very thankful to do it. And I had a former student I taught school for years that helped me and said, "Hey, I'll work as a cameraman, for you." And we teamed up to shoot the film.
Now, these trips are always very special, and serendipity plays a lot into this, kind of a being in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people. I know your film shows a lot of interactions with the locals in France and Belgium, and tell us about those folks that you met that are carrying on the memory of the war in Europe.
You hear so much about how people are in France are rude and this and that. And I, after going there, especially in the countryside, I couldn't believe the reaction. Once people knew what I was there to do and what my goals were, people really opened their doors and went out of their ways to help me. And I think so much of that kind of friendship, perhaps, in every big city, maybe you go to Paris, or same would go into Chicago or somewhere, you're going to run into some rude people, but that didn't typify at all the experience I had both in France, Belgium, and Germany. Once people knew what I was there to try to commemorate, and it was, there were things that happened that really were just kind of beyond belief. For a great example, one day I was trying to shoot to get this spot where Task Force Lovelady had really been hit hard, and they ran into the Panzer-Lehr division in Normandy. It was called at Hill 91, and we couldn't shoot at the spot. It had been commercially developed. There was kind of no way to get a decent shot, and so kind of reluctantly went into this cafe and got a cup of coffee, and ended up talking to the proprietor and his wife. And in a roundabout way, it turned out I found out more there because the owner of the cafe had actually collected all these artifacts from the battlefield nearby, and in a back room had shells and cases, had actual Panzerfaust in his house. These things that he and his family had picked up, and then brought out photos. And in the photos were actually photos from my grandfather's division that I recognized from other research. So, and there were things like that continued to happen that were just amazing.
It's kind of a sort of an up and down emotional journey. I remember, for example, Larry from Saint Pois, who found out what you were doing and wanted to make sure he had a drink with you, and was appealing for Jimmy Fallon to come have a drink with him in Normandy. And then your interactions with some of the eyewitnesses in Belgium, and so you go from these celebratory ones to these somber ones where you're getting a story corroborated. And what were those like?
Well, Larry especially, he was the good comic relief, because it's a heavy story. You need to have some of that, and definitely, that is something important in the whole book. It's like my grandfather's sense of humor and everything. So I didn't want it to be all droll, and luckily ran into Larry. Mm-hmm. And he was such a animated guy that he wanted to kind of show us around, and then he also had some very powerful points to make in addition to that. But he was probably the most colorful guy that definitely saw an American camera and thinks, hey, I'm going to be on in the limelight. So that was cool. But there was just so many people that were a part of this that I really never conceived that I would meet that many people. And the initial goal was actually I was going to try to bike the whole distance. And just so many people kept coming forward, or they knew a relative that wanted to talk to us, or somebody wanted to give us some information. that I had to cut a lot of that out, which was, more important to get the story and talk to these people. And there are many interviews that didn't even make it in from just, for example, I was in France, and the only Tiger tank there is right near the Battle of Falaise area. And it's a French city that starts with a V, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it because I butcher French words pretty throughout the film. So anybody that speaks French, I'm sure will get a kick out of that. But there was a fellow there. We were looking at this tank and getting a little footage of it. And turned out he was an American historian who took tours of people to show them that very battlefield. We were able to talk to him about everything that happened there and get a lot of details. Just things like that kept occurring, throughout. So it was great.
And you're bringing up Falaise and sort of end of that battle. And that's, I think, when the trip almost became like a genealogical connection for you when you were on Hill 262 North at Montormel. And so you had these moments of Polish history intersecting. And what was that like?
That was probably one of the more powerful experiences. When I saw those, they have a series of different little monuments there. Then they're all written out. One's in French, one's in English, and another in Polish. And when I saw it written in Polish and just thought about how much it would have meant to my grandfather to be there and how much the Polish tradition was part of our family, I was really kind of overwhelmed with emotion just thinking about it. It's like I almost kind of felt his presence at the Pride to be at the spot where the Poles had held back some of the most elite German troops there and showed that the Poles were successful soldiers. And there's so many like negative things about, Polish jokes and all that stuff. A lot of it came out of World War II. Not to say that our family didn't even tell a lot of those Polish jokes. We have a good sense of humor. Nobody took that really personally, but there's always been kind of a negative connotation about how easily they were overrun. And so that place in particular just kind of signified that Polish people are an amazing people that have an amazing history, and they are survivors. And it's very cool to feel a part of that and a connection to that personally.
And I know that a small town like Pocahontas and these small towns in Illinois at that time were mainly made up of the immigrants and their direct descendants. So there's a close-knit community feeling there. And when your grandfather went to war, many other young men from the town, as I say many, it's a very small place, but many of the young men his age also went. What did you gain of knowledge from Pocahontas during World War II and the fates of its young men during the war, those guys who grew up with your grandfather?
There's a picture in the book that has six guys in it. And of those six, 5 of them, I believe the other person, he had health problems, wasn't able to serve, but our physical issues. But of the other 5, all standing on Shoal Creek Bridge, actually, they all ended up in the U.S. First Army. And I didn't know this, and Grandpa gave me bits and pieces, but the more I dug through, the more I found just amazing connections between he and his friends that he wasn't even aware of. For example, Stanley Cravens was a combat engineer, part of the 7th Armored Engineers, and they constructed a bridge over the Somme River, and he actually searched for him. My grandfather tried to find him there. He saw the insignia on their vehicles and was looking around hoping to run into him, but to no avail, unfortunately. And shortly after, Stanley was killed. But in the after action reports and different things that I found, I knew for a fact Stanley was part of that operation to build that bridge. He was a rigger and served there. And then another fellow who, John Hastava, who was in the 82nd Airborne, he also served at Anzio and a lot of other horrible places before he even got into Operation Market Garden. And he was sadly killed at the Nijmegen Bridge in that failed operation. And then another fellow was Dave Pagan, who he was able to run into at the end of the war. And then probably one of the most miraculous was he was in the Hürtgen Forest campaign, and they were fighting outside a city called Stolberg, Germany. And he kept looking through the periscope. He said there was artillery coming in, and he kept looking through. And Pocahontas is a really small town, obviously. And he kept looking and saying, "I think that guy is from my town." And Joe Cady, who I know now, was from a very similar small town in Williams, Iowa, and I've met his family and everything. It was really great part I wanted to include in the film, but we could only touch on it, unfortunately, for time. But he said, Grandpa said that he was giving him kind of some flack about, oh, there's no way, because they both were from small towns. So he said, you're kind of full of it. There's no way that guy's from. And sure enough, he opened the hatch when the fighting died down a bit and walked up, and it was a fellow named Mel Weber who had fished with him on Shoal Creek. And they both survived the war, strangely enough. But yeah, so there were connections throughout, and it's been quite a journey for myself to even try to bring all the pieces together. And it always seems to kind of even go into deeper things and find out even more.
Yeah, I think you made the point 17 in your grandfather's graduating class.
Correct.
So very, very small. I think I'm from a small place. I had 130 in my graduating class. So here's your book. It's pronounced Looch, as a nickname that your grandfather had, and the documentary called A Path of the Past. And how can folks get the book, and where can they see the documentary?
The book is on Amazon, but then it's also on Barnes and Noble and that. But the film is soon to be on Amazon Prime, but presently my distributor has a channel called Valorous, and so it shows a lot of other historical and military type films, and it's very reasonable sign up. And then it's also available presently on Vimeo, and it will soon be on Tubi. So if they just search Path of the Past Vimeo, it'll come up on demand there. And then part of the proceeds is going to go to, once kind of get out of the red on film, but 10% will go to a group called Heroes Care, which does a lot for families dealing with deployment, and they're fantastic, highly rated veterans group. So I'm hoping in time we'll be able to raise some money for them also.
I know I've been seeing some questions from our viewers pop up, so I'll bring Abby back on, but as she's getting back ready, one that just popped up was about your grandfather and your own evaluation of Task Force Lovelady, I think specifically Lovelady himself.
Yes, so the question that came in was, and this is a two-part question. So one was, can you provide a map or directions of your path from Normandy forward? So this particular individual has a father who was a sergeant and tank commander of Task Force Lovelady, and wants to make a similar kind of a trip as you did. And then the other was trying to remember from your book that your grandfather did not have a high regard for Colonel Lovelady, and was wondering if they were remembering correctly.
It's a tough thing, because I've actually spoken to his Lovelady's family, some of them, and no one wants to hear animosity about but there was one particular incident, and it may well have actually saved lives in one way that I don't understand. But Lovelady actually came and took their tank away from them, the tank that they had brought all the way from Normandy into Germany. And right before the Battle of the Bulge here, in recent days, they headed out about the 18th, 19th, and they took that tank away from them. And at that point, Joe Cady had kind of a premonition and told my grandfather he felt he probably wasn't going to make it. So I feel my grandfather had some animosity towards Lovelady for that, and felt it was kind of part responsible for his tank commander's death. But who knows how that played out? It's, you don't want to judge how things happen in war. It's tough decisions.
I know within the history of the third Armored, they call Task Force Lovelady the workhorse regiment, that they were the ones seemingly always at the front, always with the job to do.
For sure. And the one place they did get kind of a break was outside of Cologne. They did kind of realize, hey, let's put them kind of on the back. But if you go through the after action reports like I did, it was just amazing how often their companies were called forth to spearhead the attacks. And why that really was, I never knew. Maybe that was partly Colonel Boudinot. But they had some very able commanders too, especially Captain Stallings, and then also a fellow named Colonel Royston, who my grandfather had the absolute utmost respect. And he was actually busted down for fighting back on a attack decision that Lovelady and Boudinot, I think, had brought forth. And he said intelligence had told him, hey, it's a very thin line in front of you, and this was in Normandy. And Royston said, well, have him come up here and look at this line himself and you see how thin it is, and he didn't like him arguing back with him. So Royston was actually sent to SHAEF headquarters and for the rest of the war after that, which what bothered my grandfather as well.
And we have another question here in regard to speaking about the war. Was there a period where your grandfather did not wish to recollect his memories of a Sherman tank driver, and how long did that last?
It lasted. That's a very good question. It's often something that comes up because that was the ethos of the time. That generation spoke very little about their experiences, and he didn't really get into the nitty gritty until I was able to get his after action reports and start asking very specific questions. And I think that's something with veterans. They don't want to have to answer all of the vagaries around what they were doing. But once I did enough research where he could answer in a way that wasn't going to put so much work on him, he became more and more comfortable. And then it kind of broke like floodgates, where he felt comfortable enough, and it was something he'd been holding up inside for so long that it was really kind of a miraculous thing that I had gone to history for it, and we were close enough. And rarely does this kind of thing happen. So that's why I felt so important to tell the story.
Excellent. Well, I think that those are our questions that we have today. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I know that I had someone pop up and they're wondering about the map again of your journey, Lou.
Get that in, but I forgot. I'm glad you said there in the book. There's a map. It's called the Task Force Lovelady map, and you probably could Google it because I think it's on Google Images. But if they just look, it's called 5 Stars to Victory, and if they put Task Force Lovelady and 5 Stars to Victory, you'll get the exact map that I followed. And it's probably out there in a lot of the stuff that I've already produced, talking about the film too. And I could also send it to you guys at the museum to forward it to whoever might like the image, because it is something from the 3rd Armored history.
I think I saw there's a Facebook page that followed your ride that was updated as you were doing the journey. So if you want to tell them where they can find that.
Yes, the Facebook page is just called Path of the Past, and the map is definitely on there. So if they just search Path of the Past on Facebook, there's many people following that, and a lot of cool ways people have brought up other photos and asked questions and connections, and a lot of people in France and Belgium have sent stuff kind of through that.
And in a little bit of a plug, one of my jobs at the museum is to set up these kind of journeys. So you can definitely reach out to us at after this talk, and we have the resources here to plot out these entire journeys, including guides where necessary, transport, hotel nights, and interactions with any of the locals we do know in the area. So it is something that we do offer as a service here at the museum as well. It's what keeps me employed. So
that's great.
And Nathan, do you want to share the email address that folks can reach the Education Travel Department at
Yes.
or
you can reach us at travel@nationalww2museum.org. I'll go ahead and put that in the chat. and that'll get filtered through our sales representatives, and then eventually it'll come to me. My name's too confusing to remember or type, so I just like to keep it straight up as email to travel first. So.
Fabulous. So again, thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us today. And for all of you who are watching today, whether it's through Zoom or through Facebook, thank you so much for joining us. Please check out our upcoming programs at the museum, which is nationalww2museum.org. So until next time, thank you all and have a safe and wonderful new year.
Thank you.
Thank you.